Well, hello, my lovely anatomists and physiologists. Michele here, and we are ready to start a new chapter. Chapter 9 is a chapter all about joints, and we have really just three areas to pay attention to. So we're going to look at in this video the way joints are classified in the body. Then we will look at the synovial joint in a little bit more detail. And we will finish up our chapter 9 by looking at what are called actions. So it's not the entire chapter of chapter 9, but it is a good amount. So to get started, let us think about what we mean by joints. So joints can also be referred to as articulations. We've talked about this word before. What we're talking about are adjacent bones or bone and cartilage that come together. So joints or articulations are adjacent bones or bones and cartilage that come together. And when we talk about how when we talk about how joints can be classified, we're going to have two methods. So we can either classify them based on their structure, meaning what kind of tissue actually connects these adjacent bones to each other, or we can talk about joints based on their function. And this is talking about how much movability is present in that joint. And what we'll see then is that every joint can be classified by both its structure and its function. So these are like overlapping sorts of categories. So I think what is useful here, is to do another one of my tables. So what we're actually seeing here is that we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 columns, and then you need 1, 2, 3, 4 rows, 4 rows. And across the top columns, let's classify by structure. So let's put our structural classifications along the top. So we have either bony, fibrous, cartilaginous, or synovial. And then let's do down the side. So let's head our rows by function. And so when we head our rows by function, we have synarthrosis, amphiarthrosis, and diarthrosis. And you've heard of the term arthritis before. So arthro means joint. So we have synarthrosis, amphiarthrosis, and diarthrosis. When we're talking about our functional categories, so our synarthrosis is talking about basically no movement. When we talk about amphiarthrosis here, we're talking about slight movement. And when we talk about diarthrosis, we use the terminology like freely movable, but you might want to think about the freely part maybe in quotations, or maybe let's put a little asterisk there. And when we talk about freely movable, this has to do the full freedom of movement has to do with the articular surface and the tendon and ligament attachments. So it's freely movable in the realm of like what it can actually do. Okay. And so our rows are labeled by synarthrosis, amphiarthrosis, and diarthrosis. These are, of course, our functional descriptions. Going back up to our column descriptions, we have bony, which means bone fused to bone. I'm just going to say fused bone as my description here. When we talk about our fibrous connections, we are literally just talking about a fibrous connective tissue. Cartilaginous connections, this could be either hyaline or fibrocartilage. And then when we talk about synovial, we're going to see that we have a joint cavity and we have a complex anatomical structures, and this will have its own video. So we'll be going into those structures in more detail as we go through. The next thing that we want to do is look at all the joints in the body and classify them based on their structure and their function. So for me, this is where the table is nice because I can kind of trace them together in the column and the rows. So to begin with, we have a type of joint called a synostosis. And the synostosis means a joint with bone connected. So synostosis should go under the heading of bony and the heading of synarthrosis. So this is bone fused to bone. And great example of this would be the epiphyseal line. So once we have finished growing in that long bone. So think back to chapter 6 and how we saw like a long bone had some cartilage at the metaphysis, and with full maturation of that bone, that cartilage fully turns to bone. So this would be a great example of a synostosis. Looking next, and that's it for bony. That's it for bony. So if you have bone fused to bone, you're not going to have slight or free movement, right? So these boxes here will be empty. Okay, looking at our next column, we have fibrous, and this is where you have connective tissue connecting your bones together. And so to start with, we can talk about sutures. So sutures we saw in the skull. We looked at specific ones in lab. We looked at the coronal, the lambdoid, the sagittal, and squamous sutures. And so all of these are examples. So here you have a little bit of this connective tissue in between the bones of the skull. We will see, depending on the point of development, you might have a little bit of movement, but ultimately these joints are immovable, and so we would describe that as synarthrosis. Another example of a fibrous and synarthritic joint, so staying in the same box, we have a gomphosis. And gomphosis is talking about the periodontal ligament that connects your tooth to the, I'm going to use the term jaw here. So jaw would be either the maxilla, upper jaw, or lower jaw, the mandible. And just to be clear, let me go ahead and underline our different types of joints that we've listed so far inside of our table. Our next fibrous joint is going to be classified as Amphiarthrosis. Remember, Amphiarthrosis means allow for some movement. And so this type of joint here is called a syndesmosis. Now, a syndesmosis joint is going to have a wide separation between the bones, but they're going to be connected by ligaments. And we're going to see this in both the forearm. Okay, so forearm, this is talking about between the elbow and the wrist. This is talking about the connection between the radius and the ulna. So between the radius and the ulna, we have a syndesmosis joint, particularly that distal end. So that's going to be at the wrist end. And we also see syndesmosis joint in the leg. Now the leg, remember, is talking anatomically from the knee to the ankle. So this is talking about the tibia and the fibula. And again, we have these two parallel bones. We have quite a bit of space in between, but we do see a connection between them with ligaments. So that's our syndesmosis joint. So we are going to get some movement that's happening between these two bones, but it's not an area where we expect to see large amounts of movements. Our next, okay, so finishing up this column of fibrous, we don't have anything in the bottom box. Moving on to our column cartilaginous. In this case, the connection between bones will be bone to hyaline cartilage or bone with fibrocartilage. And so we have one example of a cartilaginous synarthritic joint, and this one is called synchondrosis. A synchondrosis joint involves hyaline cartilage, and it's not movable. So we're going to see this between ribs 1 and 2 and the manubrium, which you remember is the top portion of the sternum. We could also use the example of the epiphyseal cartilage. Remember, epiphyseal cartilage is when the bone is elongating, so it's actively growing. It's at that location that we can also talk about as the metaphyseal plate or metaphyseal area. And so in this case, we're not expecting there to be movement. We're not expecting there to be movement between the long bone, the shaft of the long bone, the diaphysis, and the end of the long bone, or the epiphysis. The last of our cartilaginous joints is going to also be classified as Amphiarthrosis. So we have a symphysis joint, and the symphysis joint is going to involve fibrocartilage. So we have fibrocartilage here, and we see example of this in the intervertebral disc. And we also see this at the pubic symphysis. And then your cartilaginous joints, that's it. So we do not have one that is considered diarthrosis. We do not have one that's considered diarthrosis. When we get to the column labeled synovial, let's make a note that this is the most common type of joint in the body, and that any joint that is synovial, we are going to say is diarthritic. So the term synovial is used most often. That's really telling us the anatomical structure of this joint. The term diarthrosis is more that physiological description, telling us that it's freely movable. Notice again that we use the term synovial most often. There are 6 examples. There are 6 examples of synovial joints. So I'm going to list them first, and then we'll go through and describe each of these. So we're going to have the pivot. We're going to have the hinge. We're going to have condyloid. We're going to have saddle. We're going to have plane. And we're going to have ball and socket. Oops. Now, as we're looking at these descriptions, we are going to be describing from least movable to most movable. So it's important to note that even though we've described diarthritic joints as freely movable, there's a range. There's definitely a range. And when we talk about them as being least movable versus most movable, we can describe them using these terms: uniaxial, I should say. And then we have biaxial, and then we have multi-axial. And this is talking about of the 3 body planes. So frontal plane, sagittal plane, and transverse plane. So frontal, think front to back. Sagittal, think side to side. And transverse. Transverse is our cross-sectional cut or cross-sectional plane. So there it's probably not just front to back, not just side to side, but kind of like in between. That's sort of a hard one. In those three planes, how many planes can our bones move? So uniaxial would be one plane, biaxial is two planes, and multiaxial is three planes. And what I'd like to do now is actually stop our video and pick up the next video talking specifically about these joints. So stay tuned, and as always, take care of yourselves and each other.